Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.
You can tell a lot about a company by where it invests. At ConocoPhillips, we're investing in Arctic science and engineering at the University of Alaska Anchorage. And we're supporting today's students and tomorrow's engineers at UAF. In fact, today, more than 100 of our employees are University of Alaska graduates, and our future is in their hands. We happen to think that's a pretty good investment. ConocoPhillips, Alaska's oil and gas company.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 27th of March, the 50-year anniversary of the great 1964 Alaska earthquake. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with the very latest weather information and emergency tsunami information by going to weather.gov/Alaska. And as you've seen today, there have been a tsunami test alert that went throughout the state, and we did have that information on our website for you to see. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391, and during the day in between Alaska Weather, you can find our information on many other social media accounts. Looking at across the North Pacific and southern Bering Sea, storms continue to line up from eastern Asia. You'll notice their progression, though, is moving more from southwest to northeast into the western Bering, and that's where they start to die off. The leading edge of this frontal boundary is running into a very stable area of high pressure across western Alaska that you can see is eroding the cloud cover, actually pushing some across the YK Delta. We did have some reports of light to moderate rime across some of the lower and middle Yukon Valley earlier today. Meanwhile, a storm front is lifting northward very slowly. You can see that boundary edging toward Haida Gwaii earlier this afternoon. High pressure sitting across the central and southern Yukon is sending waves of low pressure from east to west across southeast and south central Alaska. A ridge of high pressure extends well into the interior, and that's kept the sky pretty clear today. Some morning fog certainly possible in some places, but the big storm on the map, if there is one, is out across the western Bering, and that's at 987 millibars. With high pressure across the YK, we can expect some areas of coastal fog, and we did see some of that around Cape Newenham today. The frontal boundary working through Adak and Atka likely produce some rain showers from time to time and some gustier winds. Gales, though, on the backside of the storm are going to be in effect for at least through tonight and into tomorrow for the west and west central parts of the chain in western Bering. Through tonight, a trough of low pressure will start to cut into the ridge that's sitting across the interior. Look for a mainly clear sky and pretty light winds, if any, across the interior tonight. Meanwhile, offshore, an opportunity for some scattered snow showers if possible. Rain showers a little bit further south, but none of that seems to be impacting southeastern Alaska. The Alaska Peninsula should be relatively clear. A trail of high thin clouds will be streaming in from southeast, running right up the coastline. Areas of fog underneath the ridge. A frontal boundary working across the central chain will likely produce some more rain showers from time to time. Some of that may mix in with rain and snow across the central chain, and across the west that might lean over a little bit more toward snow showers with stronger winds in the region. Heading into Friday, the frontal boundary is slowly creeping up on Nunivak Island in the YK Delta, as well as Bristol Bay. The strongest winds, if any, will be across the central and eastern chain and also across the west, again, where the gales are expected. Low pressure up around the Gulf of Anadyr at 993 millibars will still maintain a cold front, but again, it's creeping eastward and running into very stable air, so that leading edge is falling apart fairly quickly. The frontal boundary to the south of the Panhandle is slowly working toward the Dixon entrance. Still doesn't look like much of a chance for rain across the southern parts of the Panhandle, but by Saturday, there's a very slight opportunity for rain and snow showers to close in on places a little bit closer to the Dixon entrance there, like Heidelberg, for example. Ketchikan and Annette may be leading into that. Out across the west coast, the frontal boundary is falling apart now as we start up the weekend. Some passing clouds across south central, Kodiak Island, and the lower Yukon, as well as the Kuskokwim Delta. The Gulf Coast, the Arctic coast looks relatively clear, probably some low clouds from time to time. And another wave of warmer air is lifting northward toward the western Aleutians behind the ridge of high pressure, settling over Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. And you can see another wave of low pressure on the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Most of the action, again, still well to the west. Looking at temperatures today, upper 30s and 40s across southeast. Places across, well, from Sitka southward made it into the mid-40s. So a beautiful day around Juneau, 37 degrees, 40 in Yakutat, Prince William Sound in the 30s and 40s, 36 for Anchorage, 37 in Talkeetna. Seward and Homer both in the lower 40s, mid-30s for Fairbanks today. Eagle was 34, 27 in Northway. Around Fort Yukon and Arctic Village, temps were in the 20s today. Anaktuvuk Pass, lower 20s. The Arctic coast in the single digits in teens. Barrow 5. Looks like Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse around 5 degrees as well. And, well, Barrow is 14, I should say. Kotzebue Sound, teens and 20s there. At Shishmaref at 25. About the same on the other side of the peninsula in Nome. Unalakleet was 23. McGrath was 36. Bethel showing 27. St. Lawrence Island, Sabunga is 28. Pribilof's in the mid-30s. Kodiak Island straddling the 40-degree mark on either end. Sandpoint around 41. Dutch Harbor, Unalaska 43. And 37 way out in Shemya. Overnight low temperatures will hover below zero for Fairbanks and parts of the eastern interior again tonight. 5 to 10 below across the Arctic coast, 17 in Nome and places like Dillingham with King Salmon at 14, just shy of 30 in Kodiak Island. Upper teens and low 20s across south central, with southeast mainly in the lower 30s. Some interior locations and northward may end up in the upper 20s. The chain and the peninsula mainly in the 20s and 30s. St. Paul, you're looking at 34 with a high of 35 tomorrow, just shy of 40 degrees. 30s and 40s for southeast. The interior looking at temperatures climbing up to 40 again in Fairbanks. And it will be a milder day for places like the Mat-Su in the lower 40s there, all the way up the Parks Highway. 37 in Kenai, 43 in Seward, a beautiful day there, and 30s and 40s in Prince William Sound. A beautiful time in the Sound for sure. Flying weather looks to be severe clear once again for southeast areas of MVFR into the Dixon entrance, across the Alaska Peninsula, and from the St. Matthew Island waters and north and west. As you would expect, your past conditions are clear as a bell all the way through. In fact, turbulence should be very limited, if any. You may have to worry about some icing potential west of the Alaska Range again out toward the YK coast, but it looks like as far as past travel goes, you shouldn't have a whole lot to worry about. Tenita Pass, Portage Pass, and Chilkoot and White Pass all looking to be VFR. Freezing levels shows the surface freezing line hugging the Gulf Coast and then lifting northward now of the Pribilof, so some elevated warming working northward toward the Dixon entrance between 2,000 and 4,000 feet. Icing potential looks to be pretty limited as well. Again, we did have some reports today across the lower Yukon. That's below 4,000 feet and above 2,000 feet, but below 12,000 across the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula and up around Chignik as well. The jet stream continues to show a blocking pattern of high pressure sitting across the northern part of the interior and the Yukon. That's guiding the main storm path well south of us. And if that's where all the action is, it is completely missing Alaska at this point. So a very stable weather pattern for us with a lot of active weather coming into the western Bering and dying out as it runs into that stabilizing ridge. At 9,000 feet, we see a similar pattern here. You can see several other waves of low pressure creeping into the YK coast. A little bit of a ridge here across the west coast. Wind speeds coming in from the east across southeastern Alaska around 15 to 20 knots or so. A little bit faster across the interior at 9,000 feet than what we see at 3,000 feet. 5 to 15 knots from east to west. A stronger southeasterly flow coming across the Bering and a westerly flow zipping across the Aleutians at a ghastly rate of only 15 to 20 knots with low pressure just to the west of Bristol Bay and light winds there at this level across the northern Gulf Coast. With turbulence in play below 4,000 feet, with winds coming across the peninsula, you could expect some occasional to widespread moderate turbulence, but that's going to be out over the open water. Across the northern Gulf Coast over southeast, don't be surprised to run into some low-level wind shear, and winds coming out of the Copper River Basin are expected to be a little bit faster, some stronger gusts in that region than really anywhere else in the surrounding area. So plan on a little bit of choppy for flying around places like Cordova or perhaps heading up toward Valdez. That's a look at your aviation forecast. Of course, as today is the 50th anniversary of the 1964 magnitude 9.2 quake in Prince William Sound, it is probably one of those days where you may have rehearsed your earthquake preparedness or heard a lot about tsunami awareness today. It's always a good idea to prepare yourself and your family, and remember that In the worst case, you need to be the first line of defense for your family. Being prepared will help take you through that disaster in a much easier way, and today is a good day to start that process. As part of that, we want to offer you this brief video from the United States Geological Survey commemorating the 50-year anniversary of the quake. We'll be back in a few minutes with a look at your marine weather.
Everything was in chaos.
I'd never seen anything that destructive that close up.
In 1964, Alaska was shaken by the largest U.S. earthquake ever recorded, magnitude 9.2. Shaking went on for over 4 minutes. 143 people died. Total property loss in 2013 dollars is estimated at $2.3 billion. There were gaping fractures, massive landslides, and the destruction of water mains, gas, sewer, telephone, and electrical systems. The epicenter was in Prince William Sound, 74 miles southeast of Anchorage, yet effects were observed as far away as Texas and Louisiana. What the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake taught scientists was as profound and far-reaching. Initially, no one understood how or why the earthquake occurred. Immediately, 3 U.S. Geological Survey scientists were sent to figure it out.
The main airport, the Anchorage International, was closed down because the control tower had collapsed and killed the operator.
And then we went out separately, mostly separately, to look at different things so we could cover 3 times as much ground.
The scientists studied the effects from the air, on land, and along shorelines. They were astonished to find that the surface was disrupted over an area larger than California, 185,000 square miles. Some areas dropped down as much as 8 feet, and others rose up by as much as 38 feet. Barnacles, once 2 feet below the ocean's surface, were suddenly several feet above. Mapping this uplift and downdrop became crucial for understanding what happened. But with no faults visible at the surface to explain it, even with months of careful observation and fieldwork, the cause of the quake remained a mystery.
It was right at this time that this idea of plate tectonics, that the surface of the Earth is broken up into roughly a dozen different plates and that they move around with respect to each other. It occurred right at the time where this idea was being put forth.
One of the scientists, geologist George Plafker, considered the quake in terms of this newly forming theory of plate tectonics. He knew the theory had new crust forming at mid-ocean ridges, but there was no explanation for where this crust went.
And so the most likely one that came to mind is that the oceanic crust is being pushed underneath that part of southern Alaska at a very low angle, and there was slip on the interface between the oceanic crust and the overlying continental crust.
These 2 crusts are converging at the rate of 1.5 inches each year. Periodic slip between the crusts produces great quakes, which Plafker called megathrust earthquakes. His realization changed our understanding of these great earthquakes. Megathrust quakes are the largest known on planet Earth. They occur in areas of colliding and descending crusts, known today as subduction zones. The uplift and downdrop of large areas from these quakes is a result of the crust being compressed over years of the plates converging. It releases like a spring, which is the earthquake. Seaward areas are uplifted, while landward areas drop down. George Plafker identified this pattern common to megathrust quakes in subduction zones.
The 1964 earthquake was the first megathrust subduction zone earthquake properly interpreted as such. As a result of that, essentially every other large subduction zone earthquake around the world sort of falls in the shadow of what we learned from the 1964 earthquake.
Next, the question became, how often do these quakes happen?
One of the obvious things that everybody wants to know when you have an earthquake like this is how frequently do they occur? Could you have one tomorrow, or is it thousands of years?
Plafker and his team drilled 50 feet into the earth and collected core samples to find out. They used carbon dating to identify when past megathrust earthquakes have occurred in south central Alaska.
It's just an example of what has happened in the past, and the analog for that is what happened in the 1964 earthquake, namely an abrupt uplift of a broad area of mud flats that are intertidal, and then sudden appearance of freshwater plants growing on that surface.
In the cores, where the remains of land plants overlie ocean sediments, this marks a moment of sudden change, a past megathrust quake. Dating the plant remains provides an age for that quake. The team discovered 9 megathrust earthquakes have occurred in south central Alaska over the past 5,500 years. The average time span between these quakes was 630 years. Another devastating effect of the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake was a series of deadly tsunamis. The largest, triggered by the shifting of plates when the quake began, traveled across the Pacific, wreaking havoc in coastal Oregon, California, Hawaii, and beyond. Locally, a number of extremely dangerous tsunamis occurred in south central Alaska fjords like Whittier and Valdez. Most deaths resulting from the 1964 quake came from these local tsunamis in fjords. The scientists recognized that these were produced by underwater landslides that occurred as the quake began.
In the 1964 earthquake, of the people who died, most people were killed by tsunamis. And there's kind of 2 ways you can make tsunamis, but the way that the tsunamis were made right here in Whittier was by underwater landslides. There's material at the edges of these fjords here, and then it's shaken in the earthquake and it slides downward into the deep part of the fjord. That generates tsunami waves, which then hit the shoreline. And the thing that's really notable about those kind of tsunamis is that they hit the shoreline very soon after the beginning of shaking. And so here in Whittier, the first tsunami wave was really well observed out in the middle of the fjord, but within 3 minutes there were 3 waves that covered a large part of Whittier. And it killed about 12 people. There was a lumber mill located about where that hotel is in the background there. There were 13 deaths in Whittier and 12 of them were over there.
Chenega, a small native village in Prince William Sound, lost 23 people, a third of its population. Today, scientists use ocean bottom sonar mapping to identify submarine landslide deposits from the past. Additional work, like coring and dating these slides, will help refine understanding of the tsunami hazard and how often these quakes occur.
And at Valdez in particular, it looks like there may be like 6 to 10 of these big underwater landslide deposits at depth. So we know that these kind of things happen over and over again. You know, here we are at the margin of a fjord. We've got these big mountains. There's glaciers and streams eroding these things. They're putting sediment at the margins of the fjord. We have the megathrust underneath us here at about 12 to 15 miles depth. In these big earthquakes, it shakes like crazy, releases these sediments into the deep parts of the fjord, and then generates tsunamis. So if you're living at the edge of a fjord or recreating and an earthquake happens, a really important thing to do is to travel to high ground right away. You don't want to wait to hear a tsunami alarm or anything like that. If you feel strong shaking that feels like a strong earthquake, you need to head uphill right away. Don't wait till the earthquake is over.
Some of the most stunning destruction from the 1964 quake came from subaerial landslides. Extreme shaking led to significant ground failure and liquefaction in Anchorage. Massive landslides struck the downtown area, Government Hill, and in the Turn Again by the Sea subdivision.
What happened is through the ground shaking in the 64 earthquake, there were these blocks that sort of slid sideways as a result of that. And then some buildings collapsed into those areas. Sometimes the edge of a building was sticking off where it had failed underneath there. There were a few people killed as a result of the damage of these buildings in the 64 earthquake.
The widespread damage and loss of life from this earthquake led to a determination to use science to save lives in the future. Legacies from the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake include the establishment of the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program, NOAA's round-the-clock tsunami warning centers, new building codes, and innovations in retrofitting older, vulnerable structures. As part of the Advanced National Seismic System, the USGS now routinely monitors all earthquakes that occur in the U.S.
South Central Alaska here is the infrastructure center of the state, and it's also by far the largest population center of the state. And the work that we do, it involves basically the fundamental characterizing of the earthquake hazard, knowing which faults are active, which faults can produce earthquakes, understanding how often those earthquakes occur. And another part is understanding the local tsunami hazard, getting an idea how often they occur, and doing tsunami modeling to understand where people would be hit by these tsunamis.
Altogether, these programs can help predict strong ground motions from future earthquakes and minimize risks. For example, scientists learned that Valdez was so unstable and at such risk for earthquakes that the entire town was moved. In recent years, megathrust quakes in subduction zones, accompanied by tsunamis, have occurred in Indonesia, Japan, and Chile. The 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake changed our understanding of earthquakes and tsunamis, and had a profound and lasting impact on how scientific knowledge can be used to help reduce risks and save lives.
A pretty important day for Alaska and science history in our area, of course, but none of that matters unless you are getting you and your family prepared for what could happen again. So again, take time today and this weekend to make those preparations so that you're ready. And if that means practicing an earthquake drill because you didn't today, put that on your list of to do immediately. Here's a look at southeast. A northerly flow coming down the Lynn Canal at 30 knots may still be fairly gusty tomorrow. A 6-foot seas expected there. Northeasterlies coming offshore from the central and southern inner waterways, and then across coastal areas will run between 15 and about 25 knots. 4 to 5 foot seas on the inside, and anywhere from 5 to 7 foot seas from the Dixon entrance all the way up toward Yakutat. By Saturday, the northerlies settle down just a little bit across the Lynn Canal. More of a northeasterly flow. Still looking at the Stevens Passage and Frederick Sound area. 4-foot seas across the inner passages down south toward the Dixon entrance, and then 15-knot winds along coastal areas from 4 to 6 foot. More of a northerly flow there around the Yakutat area, also with a 4-foot sea. Across south central, a variable flow, and pretty light flow at that, around the Lynn Canal. Northerlies west of Kenai around 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Northwesterlies coming into the Barren Islands becoming light and variable once again once you head east of the islands. 3-foot seas are expected there. East of Kodiak Island, a northerly flow at 15 knots. 2-foot seas on the inside of Shelikof Strait with a 10-knot wind. Variable flow inside of Prince William Sound. A beautiful day it looks like there. Higher gusts around the Copper River Basin though, so just because you see light sustained winds here, you may still have gusts upwards of 35 knots. So again, be prepared for some stronger winds just in that immediate vicinity. As we head into Saturday, a variable flow inside and outside of Prince William Sound. Again, still expect those higher gusts around the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, light winds coming down the Cook Inlet around 10 knots or so. Northwesterly flow picks up east of the Barren Islands for a little bit of a change on Saturday. Westerlies east of Homer and Seward, and a northwesterly flow crossing Kodiak. 15 knots inside of Shelikof Strait as well, with 3 to 6 foot seas on either side of Kodiak Island. A light northeasterly flow and pretty much flat seas around Bristol Bay tomorrow in the sea ice-free areas on Friday. A southeasterly wind north of Cold Bay and on the Bering Sea side, 20 knots with a 5-foot sea. Southerlies coming into Sand Point and Perryville. Northwesterlies leaving Chignik with a 4-foot sea expected on the Pacific side, and that becomes northerly at 15 knots with a 6-foot sea on Saturday. North to northwest winds 10 to 20 knots with a 2 to 7-foot sea on the Bering side and 6 to 8-foot seas on the Pacific side Saturday. Across the Aleutians, mainly a westerly flow between 25 and about 30 knots. A southwesterly wind on either side of the eastern chain. 20 to 25 knot winds there with 10 to 11-foot seas on the Pacific side and 7 to 9-foot seas on the Bering side, with 11 to 12-foot seas out in the west and west central part of the chain. A little bit of a change as we get into Saturday. You can see the effects of the ridge sitting right across the central and eastern part of the chain with a south and then becoming northwesterly flow. So our ridge is right about here, but we're getting more of that southeasterly flow feeding into the next storm across the west and central parts. So we're going to look for some faster winds out there. Friday, again, we're talking about gales for the west and west central parts of the Bering. The winds subside just a little bit on Saturday, still looking at 4 to 8 foot seas, 7 to 9 foot seas on the Pacific side for the central and eastern islands, and 8 foot seas across the central and east in the Bering. Across the west, a broad south and southeasterly wind will rule the west coast in the Bering for Friday, 20 to 25 knots in just about all areas except the Kuskokwim Bay region with a 2 foot sea. The winds diminish as we head into Saturday, a southeasterly flow there. Westerlies coming into the Pribilofs with an 8 foot sea, and southeasterlies up around St. Lawrence Island only at 15 knots. Across the Arctic coast, an offshore flow blowing from the south and east, 20 knots, becoming more southerly and around 15 knots north of Point Ley. Westerlies around Barrow, and then a northerly flow coming into Prudhoe Bay Dead Horse with a southerly flow around Kaktovik. A little bit of a low sitting right here with winds around 15 knots. That becomes a broad and uniform easterly flow from 10 to 15 knots from Kaktovik to Barrow, and from Wainwright down to Cape Lisburn, that's about 15 to 20 knots, and then winds diminish in Kotzebue Sound as well, around 10 knots over the ice-covered waters. Recapping tonight's weather, the main activities across the western Bering, and that is pushing a cold front slowly across the Aleutians, scattering rain and snow showers for the areas around Adak and Atka, rain showers across Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, and sending some high clouds across the Alaska Peninsula with scattered snow showers across the northern Gulf, and a frontal boundary creeping up toward Dixon Entrance. Well, high pressure is in charge of most of the state. That'll keep most of us very clear and very stable and calm weather. As the frontal boundary out west creeps in on that leading edge of stable air, the boundary itself will begin to fall apart. There may still be a few scattered areas of snow and rain showers, nothing significant there across the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. New storms are forming on the western side of the ridge where warmer air is lifting northward into the Bering and North Pacific. And as the storm fizzles out across the Pacific Northwest, the leading edge of that boundary may still have some light areas of rain and snow showers across the Dixon Entrance, creeping in on places like Heidelberg, Ketchikan, and Annette. More likely you'll see more clouds than anything else. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather and getting your family prepared. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. Enjoy your night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, Alaska's pipeline to the future, delivering oil today, sustaining operations for tomorrow, committed to safety, operating the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline since 1977.